The Nintendo 64 was made by the company Nintendo. The company Nintendo was founded in Kyoto, Japan on September 23, 1889. Nintendo started out by making playing cards by hand. And as they gained more popularity, Nintendo needed more hands to fill the demand. Throughout the next 60 years, Nintendo continued to grow as a playing card company. Throughout the 1960s, Nintendo set up love hotels, had taxi services, and manufactured vacuums. All of these extra ventures by Nintendo failed, besides one new venture, their toys that they had introduced during the 1960s. Gunpei Yokoi, an assembly line worker at Nintendo, had created a toy for fun called the Ultra Hand. It's a scissor-like toy with two suction cups at one end that could extend out by pushing the two handles together. The toy was put into production and became a massive hit in Japan. It sold over 1 million units, and it took Nintendo out of the financial trouble that it was having at the time. As Yokoi had a background of electrical engineering, and the Ultra Hand being a hit, Nintendo placed Yokoi into product development. This is when other toys like the Love Tester, the Ultra Machine, which is a self-pitching machine that pitched little softballs, came to be. In 1971, Nintendo partnered with Magnavox to create a light gun controller for their video game system, the Magnavox Odyssey. In 1973, Nintendo released the laser clay shooting system inside of bowling alleys. It was a game where the player would shoot a rifle that emitted a laser light onto a projection screen that displayed targets. This laser clay shooting system became such a hit that people would go to the bowling alleys simply to play the game. In 1974, Wild Gunman was released and was much like the clay shooting system. Both of these shooting simulators made it to the European and North American markets, but due to the 1973 oil shortage, where plastics were essential need, the games were scarce. Along with the high prices Nintendo charged, they couldn't keep up, and the subsidiary of Nintendo who made these games, Nintendo Leisure System Company, closed up by the end of 1974. Within their new employees came Genyo Takeda, who in 1975 designed Nintendo's first arcade game, EVR Race, and would later be one of the lead developers on the Nintendo Wii game console. In 1978, Nintendo's research and development department was split into two facilities to work on different projects simultaneously. In 1979, Nintendo creates a subsidiary company in America in New York City. In 1980, came the handheld Game & Watch video game series. They used technology from calculators, and they became a massive hit. 59 different Game & Watch games were made, which sold over 43 million units worldwide. In 1981, Shigeru Miyamoto, an artist at Nintendo who had been with the company since 1977, in almost a last-minute rush to get Nintendo out of a jam, created a platform-based arcade game that let the player control a little man and make him jump as he dodged barrels being thrown by a gorilla. This new arcade game was called Donkey Kong. The little man players would control was named Jumpman, but would later become a character named Mario. Donkey Kong became a success and spun sequels in the coming years. In 1983, the next arcade game was Mario Bros., where Miyamoto gave Mario a brother named Luigi. Also in 1983, Hishiro Yamauchi, after many thoughts about releasing Nintendo's own video game console, released Nintendo's first gaming console, the Nintendo Famicom, in Japan. In 1985, North America's version of the Famicom, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short, was released. The NES was a huge success. Nintendo's popularity in the mid to late 1980s was red hot. With the 1990s approaching and technology improving, Nintendo started development on its new system, the next level of video games. The Super Famicom was announced in Japan in 1987. And as the Famicom and the NES ran on an 8-bit processor, this Super NES would run on double the power at 16 bits, meaning better graphics, sound, and experience. And looking at other companies such as NEC and Sega, They released their 16-bit systems, TurboGrafx, and the Genesis in Japan in 1987 and 1988, respectively. Nintendo took their time, but they did have a fire underneath them to keep up with the competition. This is when in 1988, Nintendo got into an agreement with Sony to create a CD-ROM add-on that would attach to the bottom of the Super Nintendo console. They called this add-on the PlayStation, or the SNES CD. 1989, Nintendo released their first handheld video game system that used dedicated cartridges called the Game Boy. On November 21st, 1990, Nintendo released the Super Famicom in Japan, and it became an instant hit. Once again, Nintendo was the hottest thing, regardless if they were a little late to the 16-bit console game. In 1991, PlayStation, the CD add-on for the Super Nintendo, was set to be announced, but instead, Nintendo announced that they were working with Philips on their video game system, the Philips CDI instead. This caught Sony off guard, as they saw Nintendo letting Philips use their Nintendo properties for their games. The whole background between Nintendo and Sony at this time was that Nintendo secretly canceled the original contract they had with Sony as they looked over it again and realized that Sony would have much more control over Nintendo with what they could do with this PlayStation. After this, Nintendo wanted to go back into negotiations, but by 1992, Sony cut negotiations with Nintendo. With the PlayStation a bust, the idea of the next console was in Nintendo's heads. They needed a new direction. The Summer CES trade show in Chicago in 1992 saw the use of technology from Silicon Graphics, a company who developed 3D computer-generated effects. At Nintendo's booth, a newly hired man for Nintendo, Charles Martinet, was voicing Mario's 3D modeled head, greeting and talking to visitors as they walked by. Martinet would later become the voice for Mario in Super Mario 64, as well as every Mario game in the future. But at this moment, this was Martinet's first gig. As the attendees only saw a 3D Mario head, Martinet would talk to them in real time with Mario's voice. The headset would also line up with his facial movements. Now in 1992, this technology impressed everyone, and this was the beginning of the partnership between Nintendo and Silicon Graphics. Early 1993, Silicon Graphics was wanting to expand beyond what it was originally doing. What they did originally was make graphic 3D visuals for private companies, along with supercomputing. They were the ones who made the visuals for the dinosaurs in the movie Jurassic Park. What Silicon Graphics wanted to do next was to take their technology and move it into the mass consumer market. Without getting too technical, what they had created was a computer that could use less than half the power of other computers with the same amount of quality. This also meant that the technology would be much less expensive to mass produce. Their first idea was to take this supercomputer box and take it into the video game market and shop it around to different video game companies. The founder of Silicon Graphics, Jim Clark, found himself at his first stop, which was Sega of America. He met with Tom Kalinske, who was the CEO of Sega of America at the time. Tom was amazed with Jim's proposal and was all aboard. But after Sega of Japan heard all about it, they said no to the idea. So this is when Jim, in the early months of 1993, found him at the headquarters of Nintendo of America. After Jim's proposal to Nintendo, Nintendo's CEO at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, said yes. So the main parts of what Silicon Graphics brought to the table to Nintendo was something that they called reality immersion technology. Nintendo didn't have time to waste, as they needed to stay at the top of the video game market. And at this time in 1993, the video game console landscape was changing. Other competitors came out punching. The Atari Jaguar and the 3DO both branded the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis as just toys. On August 23, 1993, at the Shinkai trade show in Japan, Nintendo publicly announced that they were working on their next console with development by Silicon Graphics. They introduced Silicon Graphics as Silicon Graphics Industry, or SGI for short, And Nintendo pointed that they had the equipment that developed the special effects from movies like Terminator 2: Judgment Day and the more hit movie at the moment, Jurassic Park. Nintendo called the code name for the new console Project Reality. With SGI on their team, Nintendo wasn't planning on joining the 32-bit era of consoles. Better yet, passing it and going into the next generation, doubling the bits to 64 instead. Describing the console as enabling players to step inside real-time, three-dimensional worlds. Around the same time Nintendo started developing the Nintendo 64 console, the game, Super Mario 64, was in development around the same time. The idea for the game Super Mario 64 started during the development of the Super Nintendo game Star Fox in the early 90s. The creator of Super Mario, Shigeru Miyamoto, came up with the idea to make a 3D Mario game. The Star Fox game on the Super Nintendo used the Super FX chip, which helped it make it into a 3D rail shooting game. Miyamoto's first idea for this 3D Mario game was going to be made for the Super Nintendo. But as the Super Nintendo was being phased out, the idea stuck with him. And as the next generation of Nintendo consoles started, using 3D graphics, Super Mario 64 went into development right away. So the first year of development for Super Mario 64 was spent on the design of the 3D Mario. They worked on how he moved, jumped, crawled, and flew. They had to make sure it felt just right before they decided to do anything else. Nintendo continued in a release statement that they were going to have the technology in arcade games by 1994, and the new console would be out at some point in 1995. Nintendo also added that this new console would be slapped with the sale price of $250. This was much lower than other new 32-bit consoles were priced. In Europe, on September 16, 1993, the Amiga CD32 was released, priced at $399. October 4, 1993, the 32-bit 3DO game system was released at a price of $600. On October 27, 1993, Sony announced that they were releasing their very own game console, the PlayStation, featuring 32-bit 3D polygon graphics. Early January 1994, Las Vegas held the Winter CES. Besides showing off the new Super Nintendo and Game Boy releases, anything from Project Reality was non-existent, except for some demonstrations of a 3D New York skyline and a shark swimming in water. As these visuals did impress people, the only takeaway from the show was that Project Reality was still planned to be released in 1995. CDs were becoming the hot new thing that video games were being released on. That wasn't what Nintendo surprisingly had planned for Project Reality. May 5th, 1994, Nintendo announced that their new console would be using cartridges instead of CDs for their games. One of the main reasons for this is that they were trying to combat counterfeiting. But besides that, they also talked about how loading speeds slowed down gameplay and how other competing consoles adding a CD player to their hardware would make the consoles easily more expensive, slapping another $100 onto the price. Nintendo then went to create something that they would call the Dream Team of video game publishers. This Dream Team of publishers that Nintendo appointed would work exclusively on the Project Reality console. The companies who made up this Dream Team, along with Nintendo, were Acclaim, Angel Studios, which would become Rockstar San Diego, GameTech, Paradigm, Sierra Online, Software Creations, Spectrum Holobyte, Williams Midway, Rare, and DMA Design, who would later turn into Rockstar North, who created the GTA games. The Dream Team was first tasked to create arcade machines using SGI's technology. 2 arcade machines were made. One arcade was developed by Rare and Midway, which became the fighting game Killer Instinct, and the other, from Williams and Midway, was the racing game Cruisin' USA. On June 23, 1994, during the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, Nintendo showed off 2 Super Nintendo games that was developed using SGI technology. One was developed by DMA Design called Uniracers, and the other was developed by Rare, called Donkey Kong Country. As Donkey Kong Country stole the show, the one other notable announcement from Nintendo was that their new console was being renamed from Project Reality to Nintendo Ultra 64. It seemed like a fitting title, based on the names of their earlier game consoles, the NES, the Super NES, and now the Nintendo Ultra 64. As how many bits a game console had meant everything back then, the 64 added on to the end fit well at the time. And at this show behind the scenes, the press were invited to play the two arcade games, Cruisin' USA and Killer Instinct. After this show and during the summer, Nintendo teamed up with Rambus Inc., which would be working on the 4MB RAM memory and the memory bus for the Ultra 64. August 1994, Acclaim announced a game they were working on for the Ultra 64, a first-person shooter based on the character of Turok, Dinosaur Hunter. September 7th, 1994, after about a year of design, production started for Super Mario 64. October 28th, 1994, the Killer Instinct Arcade was released. And then the next month, November 1994, the Cruisin' USA Arcade was released. Later on in that month, November 22nd, 1994, Sega threw their hat in the ring with their 32-bit system, the Sega Saturn. December 3rd, 1994, the Sony PlayStation was released in Japan. As the prototype console for the Nintendo 64 was being developed, the Project Reality team started working on what this next-gen console's controller would be. Developers for Nintendo who were assigned to work on the controller were directed to break the mold and try new things. They then started with a modified Super Nintendo controller. As many designs of the controller were made with clay forms, test groups were brought in at the beginning and during development to see which designs worked the best. Nintendo made over 100 prototypes to get the analog stick on the controller just right. The controller had 3 handles, and it somewhat resembled the letter M. The top of the controller had left and right shoulder buttons, labeled as L and R buttons, and the far left handle had a standard directional pad. Moving to the middle handle, it was rigged to have a Z button on the bottom, which would work as a trigger button. The middle of its face was given a red start button, but the biggest thing that set this controller apart from everything else was the analog thumbstick, giving the player a full 360 degrees of movement within the worlds in the games. Looking at the far right handle, as the games from the system were going to be inside a 3D environment, the controller was given 4 yellow camera buttons called C buttons. Along with the C buttons, the controller was given a blue A button and a green B button. And last but not least, the controller was given an extension port above the Z button. Although Nintendo wasn't the first to use analog sticks for their consoles, they were the first to have a tiny analog stick built into their controller. During the first 6 months of development for Super Mario 64, Mario was controlled by a computer keyboard. Genyo Takeda and Shigeru Miyamoto tested playing Super Mario 64 with the controller to get it just right. Super Mario 64 would be the first experience for many gamers controlling a character in a 3D environment. Miyamoto knew this, and there'd be a bit of a challenge for the majority trying to understand where the character is in the 3D space. His solution to this was to put a circular shadow on the ground wherever Mario and other objects were to give the player an idea of depth. The original Ultra 64 controller had a gray and black look to it, along with a much larger thumb analog stick. 1995. It was the year everyone was waiting for. January 5th, 1995, SGI stated in a press release that the system's main parts were finished. As Nintendo saw skepticism from the public on the Ultra 64, they announced a few more developers joining the Dream Team in the first quarter of 1995. An ad for the Ultra 64 at the time read, "You can't buy this. About to buy a new games machine? Is it worth waiting? Yes. 32-bit CD machines are fine, but they don't cut it where it really counts. They just don't have the power. This does. 64-bit power. Nintendo Ultra 64. The speed of silicon cartridge. Not CD, slow. You can't buy it yet. After all, nothing this good comes easy. But do you really want something less powerful? Wait for it. May 5th, 1995, at the very first Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3 for short, Nintendo was present. At the show, Nintendo pushed their failing 32-bit 3D portable system named the Virtual Boy. Then Nintendo mentioned that the hardware for Ultra 64 was finished, but they brought the bad news that the release date would be pushed back in Japan, December 1995, and North America into the next year in April of 1996. On August 30th, 1995, as the Ultra 64 was taking longer than expected to be released, Killer Instinct, the arcade game originally slated to be on the Ultra 64, was released on the Super Nintendo on a limited edition black cartridge. November 24th, 1995, at Nintendo's 7th annual Shoshinkai trade show in Japan, it was announced that the Nintendo Ultra 64 was given a new name called Nintendo 64. According to Nintendo, the name change happened because they wanted to have consistent branding worldwide. They also somewhat saw it silly to give every new console that they had an upgraded name, like going from Super to Ultra. The final version of the Nintendo 64 console was on display at this show with a dark gray charcoal color, a power switch on the top left side, a reset button on the top right side, and on the top's back center area, the cartridge slot. The front face of the console had 4 controller ports and a Nintendo 64 logo faceplate in the center. The original gray controller was revealed for the first time, as many other different color variants of the controller were on display as well. Now, the controllers at this time still featured a much larger analog thumbstick than what would become standard later on. There were demos of 2 playable games for the Nintendo 64 at this show, which was Super Mario 64 and Kirby Ball 64. It was stated that Super Mario 64 was 50% finished. Kirby Ball 64 wound up getting cancelled, but later released as Kirby's Air Ride on the Nintendo GameCube. Previews for upcoming Nintendo 64 games were also shown, like Zelda 64, which showed Link as a more cartoony character as he fought against a knight. Mario Kart R, which was the early title for Mario Kart 64, Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, Blast Dozer, which was later renamed Blast Corps, Wave Race 64, which at this time didn't involve jet skis, but more of a futuristic boat-looking racer game, GoldenEye 007, which at the time was an on-rail shooter type game, Star Fox 64, Pilot Wing 64, Body Harvest, and Buggy Boogie. To top it all off, Nintendo mentioned that they were developing the bulky drive for release in 1997. The bulky drive would later be renamed the 64DD, the DD standing for disk drive. The 64DD was a console add-on that was the same size as the Nintendo 64 console. The N64 console would be placed on top of the 64DD, and they'd connect through the N64's bottom side through an expansion port. The 64DD discs weren't exactly discs, but magnetic storage units inside of a flatter gray plastic shell. These games would then be loaded into a front slot of the 64DD. The Nintendo 64 cartridges on their own only had 12 megabytes of storage space, compared to the CD with 650 megabytes. The 64DD games would add an additional 64 megabytes of space. And unlike CDs, N64 cartridges weren't able to run full-motion videos and high-quality audio within their games like Sonys PlayStation could. The 64DD would give a solution to that problem, giving developers a lot more space to work with, adding higher quality and additional content to games. Nintendo announced that the 64DD would be revealed in late 1996. 2 more things were announced at the event. One was a memory card accessory. It was called the controller pack. The controller pack would be inserted into the N64 controller to save data. As most data would be saved onto the game cartridge itself, it was seen as mostly useless, but convenient when backing up customized and in-game items or stats a player achieved. And the final announcement was that the release day for Nintendo 64 was going to be pushed back yet again, going from December 1st, 1995 to April 21st, 1996 in Japan. It was now 1996. A good handful of developers in Nintendo's Dream Team didn't have the best reputations, and there was very little to no involvement from other Japanese developers. In February, Nintendo saw that most of the games slated for Nintendo 64 weren't ready by their standards, including Super Mario 64. They saw the finish line, but still needed to be polished to live up to the quality and expectations Nintendo had for themselves. Shigeru Miyamoto saw Super Mario 64 as the launch title for the system, and it would make or break the console's success. He wanted to make sure that it was the best that it could be. And in order for that to happen, he requested to delay the N64's launch by 2 months to put the finishing touches on the game. In March 1996, Nintendo 64's release date was now set for June 23rd, 1996 in Japan, and September 30th, 1996 in North America. And in Europe, a release date was set for November in 1996. Around this time, magazine ads for the N64 displayed Mario standing on a globe of Earth as he swung Bowser by his tail. The ad read, "On September 30th, dinosaurs will fly." Because on that day, the home entertainment world starts spinning in 64 bits, faster than any video game system or personal computer ever made. Live your dream. Nintendo 64 and its revolutionary 3D controller will send you as far into the game as you dare to go. Over the top, out on the edge, choose your hero. James Bond, Ken Griffey Jr., Super Mario, or even Darth Vader. You'll find them on games exclusive to Nintendo 64. Players will rock. Competitors will weep. Is it worth the wait? Only if you want the best. Nintendo 64. May 16, 1996 kicked off the second annual E3 in Los Angeles, California. This is when the Nintendo 64 was revealed for the first time in North America. The Nintendo 64 was described as having the memory power of transferring 15 Donkey Kong Country games every second. It was announced that the Nintendo 64 would be released on September 30th and would be on sale for $249.95. As Super Mario 64 was the centerpiece game at the event, many other games, such as Pilot Wing 64 and Wave Race 64, were shown. Designer Ken Lobb mentioned that the prototype cartridge of Super Mario 64 was very tall, but the final version of the cartridge would be half the size. It was at this E3 that they unveiled the Game Boy Pocket, a version of the Game Boy that was 20% smaller with a higher contrast screen. June 23rd, 1996, the Nintendo 64 was finally released in Japan. The system was sold with the console and one controller for 25,000 yen, or around $218 US. The first N64 games available in Japan were Super Mario 64, Pilot Wing 64, and Seikyo Habu Shogi, which is a board game in Japan that's like the game chess. The first initial 300,000 units of the Nintendo 64 was sold out in its first day. Super Mario 64 was bought almost in a 1-to-1 ratio with the system. Needless to say, the Nintendo 64 was a hit, and it was in high demand. June 26, 1996, Nintendo shipped out 200,000 more consoles, which sold out the same day. Nintendo wanted to create more competition with the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. So on August 19, 1996, Nintendo announced that the N64 would be priced at $199.99. Not only that, but the N64 would be released one day earlier on September 29th. Subscribers to Nintendo's magazine, Nintendo Power, received a promotional VHS tape showing off the N64. This tape was titled Change the System. So now we're in September of 1996, and the North American release of the Nintendo 64 was days away. Per usual with any kind of stock, the consoles were sent to retailers in advance before the release date, as toy store KB Toys started selling Nintendo 64s ahead of its release date on September 26, 1996. It was a complete accident, as the cause to it was miscommunication between the company's buyers and the actual staff in stores. The staff simply saw the Nintendo 64s in its back rooms and immediately put them up on store shelves. Upon hearing this news, Nintendo basically let all retailers stock the N64 a few days before release. Regardless, given a few days early, September 29, 1996 saw the official release date of the Nintendo 64 in North America. Two games were available on launch day: Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings 64. Cruisin' USA was planned as a launch title as well, but it got delayed. Much like in Japan, in North America, the N64 console and Super Mario 64 were sold at almost a 1-to-1 ratio. At the end of summer 1996, 1 million Nintendo 64s would be shipped throughout Japan. There was one problem. After 3 months, there was no new games since its release. As Super Mario 64 was great, people seemed to lose faith in the Nintendo 64 as nothing new came out.